Hello, everyone. You're all here at COP28, and you're going to hear a phrase if you haven't already heard it. Phasing out of unabated fossil fuels. It's something that is creating a lot of controversy. It is something that the science says we must do. But we can spend a lot of time talking about each of those words because precision matters when 200 countries are signing off on a document. Today, we're going to focus on one of those words, which is unabated. All it really stands for is if you're going to burn fossil fuels, if you have carbon capture technology attached to it, then you're allowed to use it. You're abating them. If you don't, that is unabated, and that's what people want to phase out. So what is carbon capture technology? It's quite basic. It's an umbrella set of technologies. It goes from all the way processes that only produce carbon dioxide, such as ethanol fermentation. It's 100% carbon dioxide with some water, to all the way actually drawing down carbon dioxide from the air. And the cost of capturing that carbon dioxide varies on that gradient. The more concentrated the source of carbon dioxide, the cheaper the technology. And the process is kind of the same for all of them. You need a little bit of tweak here and there, but it's at the heart a chemical process. It starts by taking that mixture of gases, putting it in a chemical stripper, which specifically pulls carbon dioxide out, and then compressing it into a liquid, putting it back down into an oil and gas field. It is something we know how to do. We've actually been doing it for more than 50 years. But for that period, its use hasn't been for climate purposes. Its use began as a way to enhance oil recovery, to increase the production of oil in depleted gas and oil wells. And that works because if you take carbon dioxide, it acts like soap in its liquid form deep underground, and it pushes out more oil. So in the 1970s, the oil and gas industry started using this technology. But of course, this technology does have climate use because there are certain processes that we just need to cut carbon dioxide from, even if we don't use fossil fuels. So the production of cement, for example, just the chemistry of cement produces carbon dioxide emissions. And you do need to capture those emissions and get rid of them if we don't want to keep warming the planet. So in the 90s, companies started using this technology for climate purposes, or in this case, to avoid taxes. So in 1990, Norway introduced a hefty carbon tax. Equinor, or at the time Statoil, was creating this plant, a natural gas plant, which had about 10% carbon dioxide in the mix as it was drawing the natural gas out. So to avoid the carbon tax, it instead built a carbon capture plant and then just buried the carbon dioxide deep underground, and thus avoided the carbon tax, so it could pay for the technology. In the recent decades, there have been a couple of waves of interest in carbon capture. As you can see on this slide, there have been, on the blue side, a lot of announced projects in the first decade in 2010s, and of course, in the second decade. We're going to talk through the first decade, and then we'll come back to the second decade. One of the reasons why we have a resurgence in interest is because of climate change and because of the urgency of acting on it. But the first wave was much more tied to incentives being created by government. The one place where those incentives were the greatest was the US. The US currently has the most number of carbon capture plants in the world, both for fossil fuel extraction and for simply burying carbon dioxide for climate purposes. It's also the place which has given the most incentive in the form of tax credits. And they varied over the years. In the early part, they started as little as $15 per ton of CO2. Now you can get as much as $150 a ton, depending on which type of carbon capture you do. The reason there was a wane in interest was twofold. One, much of carbon capture in the early part was still attached to fossil fuel extraction. So because these companies couldn't justify the cost of carbon capture on its own, they needed to figure out a way to have an additional revenue attached to it, which was to draw more oil or more gas. And that has been a problem for the industry. Because oil and gas prices are volatile. We've seen a rapid increase in recent years, but of course, during the pandemic, we saw a rapid decline. And that meant that the total amount of carbon capture, the black there, hasn't really increased all that much. But to be on track for net zero, according to the International Energy Agency, you need 30 times as much carbon capture in the next 7 years. So why have there been problems scaling this technology? Well, we're going to talk through 3 case studies. This is a project in Australia built by Chevron. It was supposed to be built on a natural gas facility where, again, the natural gas field had some CO2 attached to it. The Australian government said, Chevron, you can build this project, but only if you will also capture about 80% of the emissions that come from it. Chevron said, yes, we'll do that. The plant was built for $2 billion, the carbon capture plant. It was supposed to capture 4 million tons every year. The best it has done ever has been 2.7 million tons. The most recent figures are 1.6 million tons. There have been a number of technology problems, some which are quite dumb, such as just using the wrong kind of steel in the pipe, and that caused the process to not work properly. In other cases, the technology works perfectly fine. Again, we know how to do this. This is a project in the US, in Texas. It's a plant, a carbon capture plant attached to a coal power plant. It takes the CO2 and then sends it off to an oil field. It was built for about $1 billion. It captures about 1.4 million tons. It was built on time, on budget. It got some government grant, but most of its revenue were coming from being able to extract oil. Now, in 2020, oil prices went negative, and Petronova had no economic incentive to continue. So it stopped operating, and now oil prices are back up high, and it began operation earlier this year again. Another example is one that me and my colleagues here at Bloomberg Green wrote an investigative story looking at, is the Occidental plant in the US. This is the world's largest carbon capture plant by capacity. Doesn't look like much because it's a satellite image, but it can capture 8.4 million tons. It was built on time, the technology worked, but its economics were attached to extracting natural gas. And when it was built in 2010, immediately after that, natural gas prices cratered. And so this plant never really ran for more than a third of its capacity, and in the last 3 years, really just ran for 10% of its capacity. And because point source carbon capture, or capturing from smokestacks, has been hard, and that's been one of the many problems why we continue to put out record amount of greenhouse gases, we are now being forced to consider the more expensive option of actually not just scaling the technology at smokestacks, but also drawing carbon dioxide from the air. So Occidental Petroleum, again, the same company, is also investing in direct air capture. This is where you simply take air and you pass it through these chemicals and capture the CO2. But for the same price tag of an 8.4 million ton project, this one is only able to capture 500,000 ton because it's a new technology, and the energy required to capture CO2 from a diluted stream of gas is enormous, and so it just is much more expensive to run the process. Now, to talk a little more about the details around carbon capture, the policies, the many steps that we need to get through to actually scale this technology to make a meaningful difference to act on climate change, I'd like to invite my panel of experts. Neil, Brad, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Now, let's start with the US and why the US has been the place that has deployed this technology the most.
Well, so I think your intro captured it well in terms of there's this fortuitous synergy between, back in the 1970s, the oil and gas industry had been producing in certain fields for decades, and their conventional strategies for recovering oil had run their course, and they experimented with CO2 essentially acting as a solvent. So they basically excelled over time at large-scale capture, transport, and geologic injection of CO2, admittedly for other purposes. But through that process, what they discovered is that at the same time you're producing that oil, you're accomplishing secure geologic storage. So it's a form of geologic storage, it's just you have hydrocarbon production associated with it. And of course, as climate policy evolved, then the perspective on what could be done with geologic storage evolved as well. You mentioned Norway is a great example. I think the thing that I would note in addition to your summary is that, and contrary to widespread public perception, until 2018, there was little or no policy support for carbon capture and storage in the United States or almost anywhere else in the world. And that's not how it's seen. There's this perception that tens of billions of dollars have been invested in the technology. It's just not true. The first real shot of investment in the United States was in the 2008. We had the financial crisis, and then we had our federal stimulus, economic recovery legislation. There was about $3 billion invested in projects then. Several of our large-scale commercial demonstrations that are operating today came from those dollars. But the corresponding investment in renewables was over 10 times that. But the critical difference, which is not recognized, is that the carbon capture did not have a functioning tax credit at the time. There was a tax credit in law, but it didn't work. And I don't have time to get into why, but it just didn't function to drive investment. So,
well, but there was the first wave of interest, as we saw in the slide. There were a number of projects that were announced during that first decade after the financial crisis, and the 45Q tax credit at least was introduced even if the rules weren't agreed on. And so you're saying they didn't get built because the tax credit rules weren't
right.
clarified.
So actually, even the example you cited, Petronova, the power plant near Houston, which, as you rightly pointed out, on time, on budget, worked very well, did not take the tax credit.
Yes, but
because
it
wasn't
got
yet
a
available.
Department of Energy grant for about
right. But going forward now, we have a policy framework that is arguably the most robust in the world, and it has two parts to it. There's the tax credit component. Our 45Q tax credit is if you capture and store CO2 in a saline geologic formation with no oil production, you get $85 a ton. And for direct air capture, capturing CO2 from ambient air, it's $180 per ton. The federal investments, the other piece of this then is we have our national infrastructure legislation, which passed 2 years ago. And within that legislation, there's $12 billion dedicated over 5 years explicitly to carbon management. So carbon capture at point sources, carbon dioxide removal, and CO2 transport and storage. And so those demonstration dollars are available to projects, and they will also be able to claim the tax credit, which is exactly what the renewables projects had in the late 2000s.
Yep.
That's how in the United States we commercialized utility scale solar projects, was a combination of federal dollars and tax credits. And until now, that wasn't available to carbon capture.
The missing part in that is a lot of those solar and wind projects were also built by private investors. Now, Neil, you've looked at carbon capture for a few years now as an opportunity to invest in. Have you invested in it?
We have, well, first, Akshat, I want to thank you because when you and I first met, actually by coincidence in UAE, I think it was 2017, 2018, I think I made some offhanded comment about, serious investors don't look at carbon capture, and you taught me, you gave me some of your articles, and taught me to look, and so thank you personally, not just for that, but for your excellent reporting on this. We are investing small scale within portfolio companies at first. I'm happy to give some of those examples. I think it's important though to just take a step back and just remind people about the scale of the energy transition and the capital required, right? I mean, we're talking about a multi-trillion-dollar need every single year across the climate space, of which the energy transition is the biggest. And of course, carbon capture is really fundamentally also about the industrial decarbonization and transition. And what we see is that there's a real lack of capital available for an important piece of it that I think people forget, which is this transition is incredibly CapEx intensive. You have to do very large investments to decarbonize at scale. And this is where carbon capture and a number of other technologies come in, where you're talking about investments of several hundred million, even over $1 billion in equity per project. Right? And as we look at capital formation today, there's a lot of work being done very early stage in the venture space, taking true technology risk. There's a lot of work being done, this is on the equity side, in growth investments, so small scale demonstration, this kind of stuff. And then there's the other end of the spectrum where there's almost unlimited capital available for operating renewables, right? Because they're very, very low risk, lots of sovereign capital coming in, insurance capital coming in, et cetera. All of that's great, and we all know that we actually need more of that. But in the middle, for these scaled decarbonization solutions, we see a real lack of capital available. And what that means is you can have a great tax credit regime, you can have, hopefully, more proven commercial solutions, but there's not a capital available at the right price. And so I think that's where we need to start as we look at investing in this space.
And where do you think that capital could come from, if it is to come at all?
Well, I have at least one idea, but we'll save that kind of self-promotion for later.
So
but I think there is a lot of interest because there's something interesting about this need, which is that because they're hard assets, right? You need facilities to produce green electrons, green molecules, green widgets, green bytes in the data space. Because you have those hard assets, because they're at scale, you naturally have off-takers who are larger companies, sometimes governments, with reasonable credit. And so what you need to do is basically create structures that you can apply project finance to, which doesn't exist today for carbon capture. And then step into that with a sort of like, for us, I'm with our infrastructure business, with an infra-like mentality where you're buying down the cost of capital.
So one of the things that when I talk to financiers, big banks who are going to get into project finance, they point to the fact that, look, carbon capture technology is, as I said, many things, because it could be applied to many different sources of CO2. So the very capture part is many things. But then the capturing is not enough, right? You have to then actually sink it down. So it's carbon capture and storage.
And transport.
And so to get to the point of storage, you have to have transport. So typically you have at least 3 components that need to work in tandem.
That's right.
And there is now a tax credit, a big one. I mean, that even under Trump, one of the things about the US is that even though it has no agreement on science on both sides of the party, there is agreement on carbon capture technology on both sides of the party. Under Trump, there was a bill passed that increased the 45Q tax credit to $50, and now it's to $85. But during that period and now, those 3 steps still require regulatory permission. So building of it, not so much. Transport, state local rules. Sinking, wells that need to have federal approval for. So those have been, at least from a financier's perspective, the things that have been the bottleneck, which is they feel like, okay, the technology might work, but the project is still risky because these other steps are not yet sorted.
Right, and you have project developers at different parts of the value chain, because in the United States, you don't just have one national oil and gas company. You've got upstream, midstream, downstream, different companies, and as well as a whole range of different industries that supply the CO2. And so there are a number of companies that are interested in developing geologic storage projects, but they need to have some confidence that there'll be a CO2 supply. And the other way around, if you want to finance a carbon capture facility in your chemical plant or power plant or whatever it is, you need to have some confidence that the geologic storage will be available. So 2 things: one policy, one regulatory. We are in a much better place now than we were in the first wave that you had on your slide, because one, we have a functioning tax credit and it is truly robust, and it was actually designed with investors in mind as opposed to some of the earlier tax credits. We also now have a $5 billion commitment in our infrastructure legislation that's dedicated to standing up a financing facility in the federal government for CO2 transport, which will leverage federal dollars, or private dollars many times over. And then we are specifically co-investing region by region in the development of geologic storage sites, even as we're incentivizing the capture through the 45Q tax credit. So a project developer that is interested in integrating all parts of the value chain with project partners will be able to have funding for the CO2 transport and storage side and financing, and can seek the tax credit, and in some cases go for demonstration dollars on the carbon capture. That's the policy side.
Yeah.
We have, the response to that has been, there's nearly 200 carbon capture projects that have been publicly announced. There's 160 some applications at the federal level for geologic storage permits. So there's been an enormous groundswell of interest in project development. The greater challenge is actually not policy now, in my view, but financial and regulatory certainty with respect, can you get your permits? So the 160 some what we call Class 6 geologic storage permits.
These are just basically wells that have to be checked by the Environmental Protection Agency, that those are places where you can actually sink the CO2 and it'll stay there, and that will be monitored and verified.
In over a 10-year period, there was an agreed process to develop that regulation and that approach with our Environmental Protection Agency and industry and other stakeholders. So it's now in place.
But how many of the Class 6 wells have been approved in those 10 years?
Just a handful. And we have 160 some pending.
My last count was 2. Has that increased?
Well, okay, so there's some that are in the final stage of comments. But yes, I mean, as far as actually final permits, it would be 2, 3, I can't remember exactly. Now, in the United States, which is different from some countries, federal agencies can delegate to states, if states meet federal standards, the ability to permit. So there are 2 states, my own state of North Dakota and Wyoming, that are doing their own Class 6 geologic storage permits, and North Dakota already has approved permits. So it's more nationally than that. But it's going to be a challenge, and the point I would make is, just as we need to have scale technology to meet a climate challenge, we need to scale permitting to meet a climate challenge. The final thing I'd add to this, though, is our incentive and funding framework is so robust that another major constraint is local support. We are seeing, as you do around the world, growing opposition to projects and infrastructure. And it's not just projects that are like carbon capture, it's things like wind, solar, electric transmission, it's across the board.
Not in my backyard NIMBYs.
Well, yes, but it's across the political spectrum. It includes, community activists in the Gulf Coast that are approaching it from an environmental standpoint. In my own region of the Northern Plains, the North Dakota, South Dakota, that region, you have very conservative farmers and ranchers that are opposing CO2 pipelines and wind farms. And so we're having to change how we work as a federal department, as government, and how we engage with communities and stakeholders, because we won't meet our deployment goals and thus our climate goals unless communities welcome these projects.
One place we should look at just outside of the US, where we know we've seen scaling up of clean technology done with clear incentive structure and then a lot of success, which is China. And they've done that for wind, solar, batteries, electric cars, now trying to do it with hydrogen. But the reason they've been able to do it is because there's that consistency. There is that view that we want to invest in this technology, but also that they can eventually make money from it. When I first started looking at carbon capture, this was back in 2017 when we talked, China was interested in the technology, but it's not really done much. So Neil, one question for you, because you don't invest just in the US, you have a global view, and you invest in infrastructure of all kinds, not just carbon capture. So what is it that you have learned from your global investing hat on when you're investing in clean energy technologies, carbon capture being one of them? What works, and what would you seek apart from the project finance gap that is there to ensure that there will be more investment going into this technology?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we're a global investor, and I invest in a number of countries around the world. across most of the, well, actually all of the continents to some respect. You had asked, for some of the investments we were doing, and so in the carbon capture space, as an example, we're invested in a company called Contour Global, which is, as the name implies, a global power generation company that's been doing carbon capture for over a decade. It's small scale, but in parts of Europe, including Eastern Europe and in Africa, we're doing carbon capture inside the fence of bottlers. So the technology, it's called a quad-gen technology, and it is improving efficiency of just the power generation by a third, but it's also capturing 95% of carbon dioxide emissions and
then
making them food quality,
fizzy drinks,
and then goes back into the drinks, right? Now, I'm not going to say that something like that is going to solve the global climate change need, but the reality is that, like, yes, they're big projects like Petronova get all the attention, but this is happening today. It's real, and that's purely commercial, right? And so I think that as a traditional infrastructure investor, you sort of start with what is commercially viable today. But I think we also have to live with the reality that in the climate space, this is a policy-driven transition.
Yeah.
Right? Yes, we all know that commercial solar is competitive today with certain conditions, but you still need in the U.S. a renewable energy standard. Or in some cases, you need a production or investment tax credit. Similar schemes in every country. You mentioned China. Same in Europe. Europe
has a carbon
ETS.
price. Yes,
exactly. It will
and
soon
it's a
have
pretty healthy
CBAM.
one, right? 90 euros
Exactly.
a ton, $100 a ton.
And so I think for investors in this space, you have to get used to something very uncomfortable, which is being able to navigate these policy frameworks that for most of us, you sort of would have preferred to kind of avoid for the most part before. Like I don't, by nature, I don't want a grant from the Department of Energy.
The applications are complex.
And they're complex, and then you have, the government, basically sitting on your board. Do you really want that kind of stuff? Like, it's awkward, right? But we also have to deal with the reality that, like, we've mostly talked about the United States now, but and there is carbon capture projects, of course, happening. You mentioned Australia, Norway is doing a lot, the UK, Brazil, et cetera. But the US is where the action is right now, and it's really because of the IRA and the government incentives pushing you there.
One other thing that we'll need to do is not just deal with the challenges that are there to invest in the US in that technology, but also then take it to other countries. Mm-hmm. And we've done that without a plan in the past. Take solar, for example. The panel was invented in the US in the 1950s, was really scaled up in Germany and Europe when they brought in huge incentive to try and deploy the technology. But then China found a cheaper way to make it, and so now it's there. But this happened without any coordination. Is there any attempt being made to figure out what the US government has as an understanding of scaling this technology, or technologists or investors have, to then take it to other countries where there may not be a carbon capture plant, or where there is one but you want more?
Yes, and I want Neil to speak to the investment part of it, because that's not my area. But in April, President Biden announced the Carbon Management Challenge at the Major Economies Forum, and we have been working ever since to recruit countries. There'll be a COP presidency event on Tuesday that will convene, I actually don't know yet how many countries, but a lot. There are 18 countries that have joined now, and what's interesting about it, it includes countries that have no fossil fuels and fully decarbonized power sectors like Iceland and Sweden. It includes the largest oil and gas producers in the world, the United States, UAE, Saudi, Canada, Norway, et cetera. It includes developing countries like Mozambique, Colombia, Egypt, Malaysia. It's an incredible diversity of countries, and one of our top priorities in this work to start is to have a finance work stream to take this whole multilateral discussion around finance and bring more focus on carbon management because it doesn't get the attention that some of the other essential climate pathways do. Also, there's a number of enabling things that don't cost a lot of money but are essential to attract investment. Countries have to have a credible and certain regulatory framework. You also have to characterize reservoirs for storage, and if they aren't oil and gas fields, chances are they've never been characterized because there was no business motivation to do it. So countries have to identify the very best reservoirs for geologic formations for storage. So we are actively supporting countries already, but through this carbon management challenge, we really want to ratchet that up. And hopefully with some of these enabling pieces in place, it also makes it easier for private capital flow. The other thing that we want to work on is in some parts of the world, especially Southeast Asia as an example, maybe most prominently, some countries are going to be storage locations, storage hubs for other countries. Japan wants to export CO2 to places in Southeast Asia, offshore geologic storage hubs, and import energy from those countries. And these Southeast Asian countries are excited about that opportunity. But then you need to be able to have carbon credits and finance work and regulation work across international jurisdictions, and that has not yet been developed in the world today.
So we're coming to the end of the session. I wanted to bring this back to the start, which is we're going to talk about the phasing out of unabated fossil fuels. We don't know if all the countries sign off. We know that there are more than 100 countries now wanting that to be in the final agreement. If it does come through from an investor standpoint, how much does the final communique that's been agreed upon by 200 countries matter, right? We know tripling renewable energy likely will get through, but that is kind of doable right now. Bloomberg NEF estimates say we would have reached 9.4 terawatts anyway. We need to reach 11 terawatts for that tripling. So there's a gap, but it's not huge.
Yep.
For carbon capture, we're talking 30 times the gap. Will the use of phasing out of unabated fossil fuels, will that give you confidence that this technology is something governments will invest in, there'll be regulatory policies, and then you will find more projects to invest in?
Yeah, I mean, maybe a couple of thoughts on them. And one is, many years ago, over I guess 13 years ago, I used to work in the US government, actually worked in foreign relations, and I understand the value of communiques and this sort of stuff, but you don't make an investment based off a communique, right? You make an investment based off of a commercial case, right? And I think we have to be realistic that for large-scale carbon capture, the commercial case is still struggling to be shown. That doesn't mean it doesn't have great potential. It also doesn't mean it's ever going to be the only solution. But in some cases, there's still a variety of technologies. There's still technology to be de-risked in some aspects of it. We haven't talked about direct air capture, for example. Still needs to be proven. There's the very basic issue of you need to have that carbon you're capturing and either utilizing or sequestering needs to have some value put to it, right? And so this, it can be through a subsidy. It can be through a carbon price, like we talked about in Europe, the ETS. It could be a regulation, like the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is going to figure into pricing for carbon capture. Ideally, the CO2 itself has a value as a feedstock. That's the Contour Global example that I used.
Or there are mandates, like in the case of Chevron in Australia.
Or that as another real example, that sequestration is also adding value to your product. And so we're also an investor in Sempra Infrastructure Partners, which is actively developing a sequestration project at the Cameron LNG facility. That's going to sequester 2 million tons a year in saline aquifers. Their earlier stage on the Port Arthur facility, 38,000 acres of porous rock available for that project. I say those because they're real examples. They're real capital being put into it. And that will then create greener LNG. And I know that that's an oxymoron for some people. I get it. But we know that there's a future for LNG, so it better be greener, right? So you're adding value to your product. And so there are all of these pieces that have to make it available. I mean, there has to be an ecosystem around, right? The industrial sector is the place that you're going to have most of the carbon sequestration. You have to have the infrastructure. And I think the final thing I would say on it is that it has to be real, right? the emissions that you're capturing, sequestering, utilizing, they have to be
monitored.
relevant.
Yep.
They have to be credible. They have to be significant. And we have to have, and that credible piece, I think, is really important for us as investors. You have to have third-party validation that it's happening and that those are durable solutions.
Yep.
Because no one should be marking their own homework.
Well, this has been fun. We can keep talking for a long time. Unabated fossil fuels may get signed off, and we might be coming back here and talking about not tripling of carbon capture, but 30 times the carbon capture over the next decade. So
We have to be talking about that soon.
Thank you.
I hope we are. Thank you.